The barn was already burning when Lila Mercer heard the first rifle shot crack across Red Butte Valley. She'd been a bride for less than 2 months, a mail-order arrangement with a silent giant who barely looked at her. Now she stood in her nightdress watching orange flames claw at the winter sky while shadows with guns circled the ranch like wolves. Her husband had run into that inferno. His mother was screaming, and Lila had to choose, hide in the cellar like she was told, or prove that the girl from the Baltimore tenements was tougher than Wyoming ice. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter of 1878 arrived in Red Butte Valley like a creditor collecting debts, and Clara Rourke knew she was running out of time to pay hers. She stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, her hands trembling as she tried to button her coat. The trembling had started 3 months ago, just a flutter in her right hand that she'd blamed on age and cold. Now both hands shook constantly, and this morning she'd dropped a coffee cup that shattered across the pine floor in a spray of porcelain and dark liquid. Her daughter-in-law Margaret had rushed to clean it, and Clara had seen the worry flash across the younger woman's face before she smoothed it away. Margaret was kind. Margaret was competent. But Margaret had her own household to run, her own 3 children to raise, and her husband Samuel, Clara's younger son, worked sunup to sundown managing the southern pastures of the Rourke Ranch. It was Gideon who needed help. Gideon who lived alone in this big house that had once been full of voices and laughter. Gideon who hadn't smiled since they'd buried Thomas 2 years ago. Clara watched her older son through the frosted window. He stood in the ranch yard talking to Jed Hawkins, the foreman, his massive frame silhouetted against the pewter sky. At 6 feet 7 inches, Gideon Rourke looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains that ring the valley. His shoulders were broad enough to carry fence posts like firewood, and his hands, scarred from rope and leather and the 100 brutal tasks of ranch work, could gentle a spooked horse or snap a man's wrist with equal ease. He'd done both in his time. The scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone was courtesy of a knife fight in Cheyenne when he was 19. The slight hitch in his walk came from a bullet he'd taken during a range war 3 years back. And the darkness that lived behind his gray eyes, that had settled in the night they'd brought Thomas home draped across his saddle, murdered by rustlers over a dozen head of cattle. Clara had watched her son transform from a man of few words to a man of almost none. He ran the ranch with brutal efficiency, worked himself to exhaustion, and lived in this house like a ghost haunting his own life. The hands respected him. Some feared him. None dared get close. And Clara, watching her hand shake as she tried to grip the windowsill, knew she couldn't keep house for him much longer. "Mama?" She turned. Margaret stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a pretty woman, dark-haired and sturdy, with the kind of practical beauty that wore well over the years. She'd given Samuel 3 fine children and managed the southern ranch house with skill and grace. "You should sit down," Margaret said gently. "I'll finish the bread." "I'm fine." "Mama." Margaret crossed the room and took Clara's elbow. "Please. You've been on your feet since dawn." Clara let herself be guided to a chair at the kitchen table, hating the weakness but unable to deny it. Her legs ached. Her hands trembled in her lap like captured birds. "He needs a wife," Clara said. Margaret paused in the act of reaching for the bread dough. "Mama, don't tell me I'm wrong. You've seen how he lives, working until he can barely stand, eating whatever's cold in the pantry, sleeping 4 hours and starting again. This isn't life. It's just endurance." Margaret kneaded the dough with practiced hands, not meeting Clara's eyes. "Gideon isn't an easy man. He wasn't always this way." "No." Margaret's voice softened. "He wasn't. But Thomas died 2 years ago, Mama. And Gideon hasn't let it go." Clara knew the story as well as anyone. Thomas, her youngest son, bright and laughing and 23 years old, had gone after rustlers with 3 of the ranch hands. They'd tracked them to a canyon north of the valley. There'd been a fight. Thomas had taken a bullet to the chest and lived long enough for Gideon to reach him, long enough to die in his older brother's arms while the rustlers scattered into the hills like cockroaches fleeing light. Gideon had hunted them for 3 months. He'd found 2 of them and turned them over to the territorial marshal. The third had disappeared, probably into Montana or the Dakotas, and Gideon had come back to the ranch and simply stopped living. He worked. He breathed. He gave orders and made decisions. But the man who'd once played fiddle at barn dances and told stories that made the hands laugh until they wept, that man was gone. "I can't keep house for him anymore," Clara said quietly. "My hands won't let me. And he can't live like this, alone in this big house, eating cold beans and sleeping 3 hours a night. He needs help. He needs a wife," Margaret finished. She dusted flour from her hands and sat down across from Clara. "And what woman is going to want to marry a man who barely speaks? A man with that reputation?" "What reputation?" Margaret gave her a look. "Mama, half the county is afraid of him. The other half thinks he's crazy with grief. What respectable woman is going to—" "I'm not looking for respectable," Clara interrupted. "I'm looking for practical." She pulled a folded newspaper from her apron pocket and spread it on the table. It was 3 weeks old, the paper soft from handling. She'd sent Samuel into town to buy it specifically. The Denver Post, which ran advertisements for everything from farm equipment to mail-order brides. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes scanning the columns of tiny print. Matrimonial advertisements? Women looking for husbands, men looking for wives, practical arrangements for practical people. Clara's finger trembled as she pointed to one particular section. "Look at these. Hardworking woman, 34, seeks ranch husband, can cook, sew, manage household." Or this one, widow, 41, experienced with cattle and children, desires partnership with Western rancher. "Mama, these are desperate women." "They're practical women," Clara corrected. "Women who understand that marriage is work, who aren't expecting romance and poetry, who just want a solid arrangement with a solid man." She met Margaret's eyes. "Gideon is Schwadmad. He owns this ranch free and clear, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, water rights, a house that just needs someone to care for it. He's not a drunk. He's not cruel. He's just alone." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the newspaper to Clara's trembling hands and back again. "You're serious about this?" "I'm dying," Clara said flatly. "Mama, don't. We both know it's true. Whatever this is," she lifted her shaking hands, "it's getting worse. In 6 months, I won't be able to button my own dress. In a year—" She let the sentence hang. "I need to know Gideon will be all right, that someone will be here to keep this house, to remind him that he's human, not just a work animal." Margaret reached across the table and gripped Clara's hands, steadying them. "And you think some woman from a newspaper advertisement is going to fix him?" "I think," Clara said carefully, "that the right woman might help him remember how to live instead of just survive." Outside, Gideon's voice rumbled low as he talked to Jed about moving the cattle to the winter pasture. Clara watched him through the window, this massive, lonely man who was still her son, still the boy who'd carried Thomas on his shoulders when his little brother was too tired to walk, still the young man who'd courted Sarah Brennan with wildflowers and shyness until she'd married someone else and broken his heart. "Help me write it," Claire said. Margaret closed her eyes, opened them. "All right, but when Gideon finds out, he'll be angry, and then he'll realize I'm right." Clara pulled a sheet of paper from her pocket, along with a pencil. "Now, how do we say this?" They worked for an hour, crossing out words and rewriting sentences. It had to be honest. Gideon would tolerate nothing less. It had to be clear about what was offered and what was expected. And it had to discourage the wrong sort of woman while appealing to the right kind. Finally, they had it. Wyoming rancher seeks practical wife. Widowed ranch owner, 34, requires capable woman for household management. 5,000-acre cattle operation in Red Butte Valley. Preference for woman experienced with ranch life, cooking, and hard work. This is a business arrangement. No romantic notions. Must be prepared for isolation, harsh winters, and long days. Room, board, and fair treatment guaranteed. Serious inquiries only. Reply to Mrs. Clara Rourke, General Delivery, Red Butte, Wyoming Territory. Margaret read it over and shook her head. It sounds like a hiring notice, not a marriage proposal. Good, Clara said. That's exactly what it is. She sealed the advertisement in an envelope along with payment for the listing and gave it to Samuel when he came for dinner that evening. He read it 3 times, looked at his mother's shaking hands, and agreed to post it the next time he went to town. "Gideon's going to raise hell," Samuel said. "Let him," Clara replied. But 3 weeks passed. Clara's hands grew worse. She knocked over a lamp and nearly started a fire. She dropped a plate of biscuits. She spilled coffee across the ledger where Gideon tracked the ranch accounts and watched her son carefully blot the pages dry without comment, his face carved from stone. She thought perhaps no one would reply to the advertisement, that it was too blunt, too cold, too honest about what life with Gideon Rourke would actually entail. Then Samuel came home from town with 3 letters. He handed them to Clara in the privacy of the kitchen, away from Gideon's eyes. She opened them with Margaret's help, her shaking hands making the paper rattle. The first was from a widow in Colorado, 47 years old with 4 children and debts she couldn't pay. She needed rescue more than partnership. Clara set it aside. The second was from a young woman in Kansas whose flowery handwriting and romantic language made it clear she'd read too many dime novels and not enough account books. She wanted adventure and passion, not cattle and cold winters. Clara burned that one in the stove. The third was different. The handwriting was clear and unfussy. The paper was cheap but clean, and the words were so direct they made Clara smile for the first time in weeks. "Mrs. Rourke, I'm writing in response to your advertisement. I'm 28 years old, unmarried, and currently employed in a Baltimore textile mill. I have no family, no dowry, and no illusions about Western ranch life. I have read enough accounts to know it is hard, isolating, and often brutal. I can cook plain food well. I can sew, clean, and manage basic accounts. I am healthy and accustomed to long hours of work. I do not drink, gamble, or cause trouble. I am not pretty, but I am sturdy and dependable. I am looking for a practical arrangement with a practical man. I will work hard in exchange for room, board, and fair treatment. I do not expect romance or affection, only respect and honesty. If these terms are acceptable, please reply. I can be ready to travel within 2 weeks of receiving confirmation. Respectfully, Miss Lila Mercer." Margaret read it over Clara's shoulder. "She sounds perfect," Clara finished. "She sounds perfect. She sounds desperate. She sounds practical, like us." Clara folded the letter carefully. "I'm going to write back. Mama, you haven't even told Gideon yet." "I'll tell him when it matters." It took Clara an hour to compose the response, her shaking hands forcing Margaret to do the actual writing. They were honest about everything: the size of the ranch, the isolation of the valley, Gideon's silent nature and reputation. They described the house, the work, the winters that could trap you indoors for weeks. They offered train fare and a month's trial period. And they warned Lila Mercer that Gideon Rourke was not an easy man, but he was a fair one. The letter went out the next day. Clara waited, anxiety and hope warring in her chest. Lila's response arrived 12 days later. "I accept. I will arrive in Red Butte on December 15th. LM. That was all. No questions, no hesitation, just calm acceptance. Clara sat in the kitchen with the letter in her lap and felt tears slip down her cheeks. Tears of relief and fear and desperate hope that she hadn't just made a terrible mistake. "Mama?" Margaret touched her shoulder. "Are you all right?" "I have to tell Gideon." "When?" "Now, before I lose my nerve." She found him in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. He stood in the dim, hay-scented space with one massive hand on the horse's neck, murmuring to her in a voice too low for Clara to hear. The gentleness in the gesture made her heart ache. "Gideon." He turned, his gray eyes flat in the lantern light. "Ma, I need to talk to you." He waited, patient as stone. Clara pulled the letters from her pocket. The advertisement, Lila's first response, Lila's acceptance. She held them out with shaking hands. "I placed an advertisement for a wife. For you." A woman named Lila Mercer answered. "She's arriving December 15th. Gideon took the letters. Read them slowly. His expression didn't change, but Clara saw the muscle jump in his jaw. "You did this without asking me." "Yes." "Why?" Clara lifted her trembling hands. "Because I can't keep house for you anymore. Because you're living like a dead man. Because I'm your mother, and I'm afraid that when I'm gone you'll just disappear into this work and this grief and this ranch until there's nothing left of you." Gideon folded the letters carefully, his big hands precise. He handed them back to Clara. "Send her a telegram. Tell her not to come." "No." His eyes narrowed. "Ma, she's already bought her train ticket. She's already quit her job at the mill. She's already packed her life into a trunk and committed to coming here." Clara stepped closer, looking up at her giant son. "You will meet her at the station. You will be civil. You will give her 1 month to prove herself, just like I promised. And if at the end of that month you both agree it won't work, I will personally pay her fare back to Baltimore." "I don't need a wife." "You need someone. And I don't have time to argue about it." Clara's voice cracked. "Please, Gideon, do this for me. Just try." He was silent for a long time, his gaze moving from Clara's face to her shaking hands and back again. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not acceptance, but resignation. 1 month, he said finally. 1 month, Clara agreed. He turned back to the mare, dismissing her. Clara left the barn with her heart hammering and her hands trembling so badly she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. Margaret was waiting in the yard. "What did he say?" "He said yes." "Did he sound happy about it?" Clara laughed, a brittle, exhausted sound. "Gideon hasn't sounded happy about anything in 2 years, but he said yes. That's enough." Well, Lila Mercer arrived on a freezing December afternoon when the sky was the color of old iron and snow fell in wind-driven sheets across Red Butte Valley. Gideon stood on the train platform with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up against the cold. Jed Hawkins stood beside him, chewing tobacco and eyeing Gideon with the wary concern of a man watching a powder keg near a lit match. "Boss," Jed said carefully, "you want me to do the talking?" "No." "You sure? Because you look like you're about to bite someone's head off." Gideon didn't answer. He watched the train pull into the station in a cloud of steam and smoke, the wheels screeching against the iron rails. 3 people disembarked, a traveling salesman with a sample case, an elderly couple arguing in German, and a woman in a brown wool coat with a battered trunk at her feet. She was small, maybe 5'3", with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her face was plain, with strong features and direct hazel eyes. She stood on the platform looking around with the calm assessment of someone evaluating livestock at auction, not the wide-eyed wonder Gideon had expected. When her gaze landed on him, she didn't flinch at his size or his scars. She just picked up her trunk, struggled with it really, the thing clearly too heavy for her, and walked straight toward him. "Mr. Rourke," her voice was low and steady, with a faint mid-Atlantic accent. "Miss Mercer." "That's me." She set down the trunk with a thump and extended her hand. Her palm was calloused when Gideon shook it. Textile mill work, he guessed. Her grip was firm. "Thank you for meeting me." Gideon grunted and picked up her trunk one-handed. It was heavy enough that Lila blinked in surprise, but she didn't comment. She just fell into step beside him as they walked toward the wagon, Jed trailing behind. "This is Jed Hawkins," Gideon said. "Ranch foreman." "Ma'am?" Jed tipped his hat. "Welcome to Wyoming." "Thank you." Lila's gaze moved across the town, the muddy Main Street, the weathered buildings, the mountains rising like walls in the distance. "It's colder than Baltimore." "It'll get colder," Jed said. "This is mild for December." "Good to know." She climbed into the wagon without help, settling onto the bench seat and pulling her coat tight around her. "How far is the ranch?" 10 miles, Gideon said. "Rough road?" "Rough enough." Lila nodded and said nothing else. Gideon climbed up beside her, Jed swung into the back with her trunk, and they started the long drive back to the ranch. The silence stretched. Gideon could feel Jed's eyes boring into the back of his head, could practically hear the foreman's thoughts. "Say something. Make conversation. Don't just sit there like a damn boulder." But Gideon had nothing to say. This whole situation was his mother's doing, not his choice, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Lila seemed unbothered by the silence. She watched the landscape roll past, the snow-covered valley, the frozen creek, the cattle huddled in windbreaks. Her expression was thoughtful, measuring. "How many head?" she asked after a while. Gideon glanced at her. "What?" "Cattle. How many head do you run?" 1,500, give or take." "That's a good-sized operation." "It's work." "I imagine so." She paused. "Your mother said you have hired hands." 8, 6 in the bunkhouse, Jed in the foreman's cabin, one who goes home to his family in town. "And the house? Just you and your mother?" "My brother Samuel lives on the southern section with his wife and kids. Ma stays with me because—" He stopped, the words sticking. "Because she's ill," Lila finished quietly. I could tell from her handwriting. "The trembling gets worse?" Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. "Yes." "I'm sorry." The sympathy in her voice was matter-of-fact, not pitying, and Gideon found he didn't mind it. He nodded once and fell silent again. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, turning the snow pink and gold. Lila studied the house, a solid 2-story structure built from timber and stone, with a wide porch and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained. The whole place had the look of a working ranch, not fancy, but prosperous and cared for. "It's a good-looking place," Lila said. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop. "It's home." He climbed down and lifted her trunk from the back. Jed tipped his hat to Lila and headed toward the bunkhouse, leaving them alone. The front door opened and Clara appeared, bundled in a shawl, despite the warmth of the house behind her. Her face lit up when she saw Lila. "Miss Mercer, welcome." Lila climbed down from the wagon and approached the porch. "Mrs. Rourke, thank you for your letters. Thank you for coming such a long way." Clara's hands trembled as she gestured inside. "Please come in. You must be frozen." Lila followed her into the house. Gideon brought the trunk and set it in the front hall, then stood there awkwardly, unsure what to do with himself. The house was warm, almost too warm after the bitter cold outside. A fire blazed in the front room hearth. The smell of cooking meat and onions drifted from the kitchen. Clara had clearly been preparing for Lila's arrival, had probably been cooking all day despite her shaking hands. Lila looked around the front room, the worn furniture, the faded rugs, the layer of dust on the mantel that spoke of a household where no one had time for fussy cleaning. Her gaze lingered on the piano in the corner, the keys yellow with age and disuse. "It's a beautiful home," she said. "It just needs a woman's touch." Clara laughed, relief and exhaustion in the sound. "That's the diplomatic way of saying it's a mess. It's a working ranch house. I didn't expect lace doilies." Lila unbuttoned her coat and handed it to Gideon without looking at him, as natural as if they'd known each other for years. "Where would you like me to put my things?" Clara glanced at Gideon. He cleared his throat. "Upstairs, second door on the left." "It was—" He stopped. "It was my room when I lived here," Clara said gently. "Before I married Gideon's father. It's small, but it has good light." "That's all I need." Lila picked up her trunk, struggled with it again until Gideon took it from her hands. "I'll carry it." "Thank you." He led her upstairs, acutely aware of her footsteps behind him on the wooden stairs. The house felt different with another person in it, less empty, but also more exposed. He'd gotten used to the silence, to the freedom to move through these rooms like a ghost. Now there was another presence, another set of eyes taking in the dust and disorder, and evidence of a man living alone. He set the trunk down in the bedroom. It was a small space with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the front yard. Clara had made up the bed with fresh linens and left a pitcher of water on the dresser. "It's perfect," Lila said. Gideon nodded and turned to leave. "Mr. Rourke?" He paused in the doorway. "I know you didn't want me here. Your mother told me in her letters that this wasn't your idea." Lila met his eyes steadily. "I won't make trouble. I'll work hard, keep the house, and stay out of your way. At the end of the month, if you want me to leave, I'll go without complaint. Fair enough?" Gideon studied her, this small, plain woman who'd traveled halfway across the country for a business arrangement with a stranger. There was no fear in her eyes, no romantic hope, Just calm practicality. Fair enough, he said, and left her to unpack. Downstairs, Clara was setting the table with shaking hands. Gideon took the plates from her and finished the job while she sank into a chair, exhausted. "What do you think?" Clara asked quietly. "I think it's only been an hour." "First impressions, then." Gideon set down the last plate. "She's not what I expected." "Better or worse?" He thought about Lila's calloused hands and direct gaze, the way she'd assessed the ranch like she was already planning how to organize it. "Different," he said finally. "Just different." That night they ate dinner together, Gideon, Clara, and Lila. The food was simple but good. Roast beef, potatoes, carrots. Clara had cooked it all despite her trembling hands, determined to make a good impression. Lila ate steadily, not picking at her food like a delicate lady, but eating with the purposeful focus of someone who understood hunger. When Clara struggled to cut her meat, Lila quietly switched their plates, giving Clara the pieces she'd already cut into smaller bites. Clara's eyes went bright with tears. "Thank you." "It's nothing." After dinner, Lila washed the dishes while Clara directed her to where things belonged. Gideon sat in the front room, pretending to read the week-old newspaper while actually listening to the low murmur of their voices in the kitchen. "In the pantry, top shelf. Soak overnight in salt water. Gideon likes his coffee strong, almost black." He closed his eyes. "Gideon likes." As if he were a child whose preferences needed to be catered to. As if this woman who'd been in his house for 3 hours was already learning the rhythms of his life. Later, after Clara had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Gideon stood at his bedroom window and looked out over the dark valley. Snow was falling again, soft and steady. The barn was a black shape against the white ground. The bunkhouse windows glowed with lamplight. And upstairs in the small bedroom, a light showed under Lila Mercer's door. Gideon didn't know what to make of her. Didn't know if this arrangement his mother had forced on him would last a week or a month or longer. Didn't know if he wanted it to. But as he lay in bed listening to the old house settle around him, he realized something had changed. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't alone in this house. He wasn't sure yet if that was a comfort or a curse. Lila woke before dawn to the sound of boots on the stairs and the front door closing with a solid thunk that shook the walls. She lay in the narrow bed for a moment, orienting herself. Not the cramped tenement room in Baltimore with its thin walls and the constant noise of the street below, but a ranch house in Wyoming where the silence was so complete it rang in her ears. She dressed quickly in the cold room, pulling on the plainest of her 3 dresses and pinning her hair back with practiced efficiency. The house was dark except for the faint glow of banked coals in the kitchen stove. Through the window she could see lamplight in the barn, a golden square in the pre-dawn darkness. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been yesterday, but only marginally. Lila lit 2 lamps and surveyed the space with the same assessing eye she'd used on the mill floor when evaluating a new loom. The stove needed blacking. The floor needed scrubbing. The shelves were organized by someone, Clara, probably, who'd once had steady hands and a system, but that system had degraded into chaos as her illness progressed. Flour and sugar sat in unmarked tins. The good knives were mixed with the dull ones. A spider had built a web in the corner above the dry sink. Lila rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time Clara came downstairs an hour later, the kitchen was warm, the coffee was hot, and Lila had biscuits in the oven. The older woman stopped in the doorway, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her hands already trembling. "You didn't have to—" "I know." Lila poured coffee into 2 cups and set one in front of the chair where Clara usually sat. "But I'm here to help. Might as well start." Clara sank into the chair, her eyes moving across the kitchen. Lila had swept and mopped, reorganized the shelves, and thrown out half a loaf of bread that had been growing green fuzz in the back of the bread box. The good knives were now in their own drawer. The spider web was gone. "You work fast." "Habit." Lila pulled the biscuits from the oven and set them on the table along with butter and honey. "At the mill, you learned to be efficient or you got docked pay." Clara reached for a biscuit, her hands shaking so badly that Lila had to steady the plate. Their eyes met. Clara's were filled with embarrassment and frustration and something that looked like relief. "I used to be able to do all this myself," Clara said quietly. Run this house, cook 3 meals a day, keep everything organized. I was never the best cook in the county, but I was competent. Now I can barely butter bread without making a mess. Lila split a biscuit, buttered both halves, and put one on Clara's plate. What does the doctor say? There is no doctor. Not within 50 miles. The traveling physician who comes through twice a year said it's probably palsy. That it'll get worse. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were bright. He said I should make arrangements. Have you? I'm making them now. Clara gestured around the kitchen. You're here. That's my arrangement. The front door opened and Gideon came in, bringing a blast of cold air and the smell of the barn. He stopped when he saw them at the table, his gray eyes flicking from Lila to the clean kitchen and back. Coffee's hot, Lila said. Biscuits, too. He hung his coat and hat on the pegs by the door and crossed to the stove. His movements were economical, practiced. He poured coffee into a tin cup and took 3 biscuits, eating them standing up while he warmed his hands on the cup. The mare foaled, he said to Clara. Colt. Healthy. That's good news. He nodded and drained the coffee. Set the cup in the dry sink without rinsing it. Started toward the door. Mr. Rourke, Lila said. He paused. What time do you want dinner ready? Noon. How many? 10. The hands eat in the bunkhouse for breakfast and supper, but they come up here for the midday meal. What are they like? Gideon's brow furrowed slightly, as if no one had ever asked him that before. Food, hot food, lots of it. Any preferences? Things they won't eat? They'll eat whatever you put in front of them. He pulled his coat back on. Don't waste time getting fancy. They're working men, not city folks. Lila nodded. Understood. He left. Clara chuckled into her coffee cup. What? Lila asked. That's the most words he's said to anyone who isn't a horse in 3 days. He doesn't strike me as much of a talker. He used to be different, not chatty, mind you, but warmer. He'd joke with the hands, play fiddle at dances, tell stories. Clara's smile faded. His younger brother Thomas died 2 years ago, murdered by rustlers. Gideon hasn't been the same since. Lila absorbed this, filing it away with the other information she'd gathered. Gideon's scars. His reputation, the way he moved through the house like he was trying not to take up space, despite his size. How did it happen? Clara told her. The rustlers, the chase, Thomas dying in Gideon's arms. The 3 months Gideon had spent hunting the men responsible, coming back harder and colder than when he'd left. He blames himself, Clara finished, for not protecting Thomas, for not being faster, smarter, better. It's eating him alive, but he won't talk about it. Some men don't talk. They just work. And that's what he's been doing, working until he's too exhausted to think. I'm hoping, Clara trailed off, that I'll distract him? That you'll remind him there's more to life than grief and cattle. Clara met Lila's eyes. I'm not asking you to fix him. I'm just asking you to be here, to keep this house running so he has something solid to come home to. Lila thought about the years she'd spent in the mill, the monotony of 12-hour shifts and the cold calculation of survival. She thought about the tenement room where she'd lived alone, where the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors fighting and the landlord knocked on the first of every month with his hand out. She thought about the carefully counted coins she'd saved, the advertisement she'd read by candlelight, the decision to gamble everything on a train ticket west and a practical arrangement with a stranger. I can do that, she said. The days fell into a rhythm. Lila woke before dawn and had coffee ready when Gideon came in from checking the stock. He drank it black, ate whatever she'd prepared, and disappeared back outside without more than a handful of words. Clara came down later and Lila would help her dress and fix her hair, steadying the older woman's shaking hands with her own calloused ones. Then came the real work. Lila attacked the house like a general planning a campaign. She scrubbed floors and washed windows. She reorganized the pantry and threw out anything that was too old or spoiled to use. She mended curtains and beat rugs and polished the silver that Clara kept wrapped in cloth in the bottom of a trunk. At noon, she cooked dinner for 10 hungry men. The first day, she made beef stew and cornbread, expecting complaints or criticism. Instead, the hands ate in focused silence, scraping their bowls clean and nodding their thanks before heading back to work. Jed Hawkins lingered after the others had left. He was a lean, weathered man in his 40s with sharp blue eyes and the cautious manner of someone who'd learned to read trouble before it arrived. "That was good eating, ma'am," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "Thank you. The men appreciate it. We've been making do with whatever we could throw together, and it's been rough." Lila glanced at Clara, who was trying to cut a piece of cornbread and making a mess of it. "I'm happy to help." Jed's gaze followed hers. His expression softened. "Mrs. Rourke's been doing her best, but this ranch is too much for one person, even when they're healthy. And the boss—" He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "Well, he's been running himself into the ground. I've noticed. He's a good man, fair, works harder than any two hands combined, but he's been carrying the weight of this place alone for too long." Jed set his hat back on his head. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Mercer. I think this house needed you." After he left, Clara reached over and patted Lila's hand. "Jed doesn't give compliments lightly. You've made a good impression. I've made stew. That's not exactly a miracle. On this ranch it is." That afternoon, Lila went through the ranch ledgers with Clara's guidance. The books were meticulously kept, every expense tracked, every sale recorded. Gideon's handwriting was small and precise, the numbers marching in neat columns across the pages. "He's organized," Lila said. "He has to be. This ranch is his whole life. He knows every cow, every acre, every dollar spent and earned." Clara turned a page, her fingers trembling. "But he does it all himself. Won't delegate, won't trust anyone else with the important decisions." Lila studied the numbers. The ranch was profitable, but not by much. There were expenses that seemed high: feed costs, equipment repairs, wages for the hands. And there were gaps where money should have been coming in, but wasn't. "You're short-selling the cattle," she said. Clara blinked. "What?" "Look." Lila pointed to a sale from 3 months ago. "You sold 50 head for $8 each, but the market price in Cheyenne was 10. You left $100 on the table." "Gideon handles the sales. He must have had a reason." Lila flipped through more pages. The pattern repeated. Every sale was slightly below market value, as if Gideon couldn't be bothered to negotiate or simply wanted to get the transaction over with. "He's leaving money behind because he doesn't want to deal with buyers," Lila said. "Or because he doesn't think it matters." "What would you do differently?" Lila thought about the mill, where every penny counted and waste was sin. "Hold out for better prices. Find buyers in Cheyenne or Denver instead of selling to the local outfit. Wait for the market to turn if you have to." She paused. "And maybe look into selling breeding stock. You've got quality animals here. Someone would pay premium for good bloodlines." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. "You've been here 3 days and you're already thinking like a rancher. I'm thinking like someone who understands accounts. That makes you more valuable than you know." Clara closed the ledger. "Gideon won't like you questioning his methods." "Then he doesn't have to know I am. But if I'm keeping house, I should understand how the house is funded." That evening, Lila made roast chicken with potatoes and carrots. Gideon came in after dark, his face lined with exhaustion. He washed at the basin by the door and sat down at the table without a word. Lila served him a full plate. He ate mechanically, not tasting the food, just refueling. "How was your day?" Clara asked. "Fine." "The new colt doing well?" "Yes." Lila reorganized the pantry. Gideon's gaze flicked to Lila. "Did she?" "Found some things that had gone bad. Threw them out, made a list of what we need from town." Lila set the list on the table. "Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, bacon, dried beans. Should last through January if we're careful." Gideon scanned the list. "This is a lot." "You've been making do with scraps. The pantry was nearly empty." "I didn't ask you to spend my money." The words were sharp, and Clara stiffened, but Lila didn't flinch. She met Gideon's eyes calmly. "You asked me to keep house. Can't do that without supplies. But if you want to approve every purchase, I can bring you receipts." They stared at each other across the table. Gideon's jaw was tight, his gray eyes hard. Lila waited, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. Finally, he pushed back from the table. "Buy what you need. But don't waste it. I wouldn't dream of it. He grabbed his coat and went back outside. Clara exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected. He doesn't trust me yet. Can you blame him? You're a stranger in his house, spending his money, changing his routine. Lila started clearing the table. I'm not here to change his routine. I'm here to make it easier. He doesn't know that yet. A week passed. The weather turned colder, and snow piled up against the sides of the barn. The hands moved the cattle to winter pasture, bundled in heavy coats and cursing the wind. Gideon worked alongside them, his massive frame impervious to the cold that sent smaller men shivering. Lila kept the house warm and the meals hot. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, early mornings and late nights, the constant background hum of work that never stopped. She learned which hands liked their coffee sweetened and which took it black, who had a sweet tooth and who preferred extra meat. She learned that Gideon checked the barn 3 times a night when a storm was coming, that he read the Cattleman's Gazette by lamplight before bed, that he kept a rifle by the front door and a pistol on his nightstand, and she learned that he was watching her. Not obviously. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable. But she'd catch him pausing in doorways, his eyes tracking her movements as she worked. Or he'd come in from the barn and find her mending his shirts, and something would flicker across his face before he turned away. She wasn't sure what he was looking for. Proof that she was lazy or dishonest or frivolous. Evidence that she'd run back to Baltimore at the first hardship. Whatever it was, Lila was determined not to give it to him. On Saturday, Jed drove into town for supplies. Lila gave him her list and money from the household fund Clara had entrusted to her. When he returned that evening, he brought not just flour and coffee, but also news. Ran into Hank Pritchard at the Mercantile, Jed said, helping Lila unload the wagon. He says the Kane outfit's been spotted up near the northern border. Lila paused. Should I know who that is? Jed's expression went dark. Outlaws, rustlers. They've been quiet for a couple of years, but if they're back in the territory? He shook his head. Nothing good comes from the Kanes. What do they want? Money, cattle, revenge, maybe? Jed hefted a sack of flour. Their brother was one of the men who killed Thomas Rourke. Gideon tracked him down and buried him in an unmarked grave outside Laramie. Lila felt ice settle in her stomach. Are they coming here? Don't know, but the boss needs to hear about it. Gideon took the news with the same stony expression he wore for everything else. He was in the barn oiling saddles when Jed found him, and Lila watched from the house as the 2 men talked in low voices, their breath steaming in the cold air. When Gideon came in for supper, his mood was even darker than usual. He ate in silence, his jaw working. Clara tried to make conversation and gave up. Lila cleared the plates and said nothing. After Clara went to bed, Lila found Gideon standing on the front porch in his shirt sleeves, staring out at the dark valley. Snow was falling again, soft and relentless. She grabbed a shawl and joined him. He didn't acknowledge her presence, but he didn't tell her to leave either. Jed told me about the Kanes, she said. Did he? Are they a threat? Gideon was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, they might be. Their brother was a rustler and a killer. I put a bullet in him when he drew on me. Self-defense, but they won't see it that way. Do you think they'll come here? I think men like that carry grudges, and I think they're stupid enough to act on them. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the darkness. If trouble comes, you stay in the house. You protect Ma. You don't play hero. I wasn't planning to. Good. He started to go back inside, then paused. You're holding up better than I expected. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd given her. Lila felt something warm unfurl in her chest. I'm tougher than I look, she said. I'm starting to believe that. The days grew shorter. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. A roast goose, gifts of warm socks and gloves that Clara had managed to knit despite her shaking hands. A stiff thank you from Gideon when Lila presented him with a new leather belt she'd purchased in town. Samuel and Margaret came over with their children, and for one afternoon the house was filled with noise and laughter. The children ran wild, delighted to explore their uncle's big house. Margaret helped Lila in the kitchen, and the 2 women fell into easy conversation. He's different with you here, Margaret said, rolling out pie crust. How so? He comes to the table. He eats real meals instead of cold leftovers. He stays in the house instead of sleeping in the barn when he's too tired to make it upstairs. Margaret glanced toward the front room, where Gideon was letting his niece climb on his shoulders. He's still grieving, but he's not disappearing into it the way he was. Lila watched Gideon swing the little girl around, careful despite his strength. For just a moment, she caught a glimpse of who he must have been before tragedy carved him into stone. A man who could be gentle, who could smile. "I'm just keeping house," Lila said. "That's all. You're doing more than that. You're keeping him human." After Samuel's family left, the house felt emptier than before. Lila cleaned up the wrapping paper and the dishes, banked the fires, and found Gideon in the barn again, checking on the animals even though Jed had already done the evening rounds. "Your family is nice," she said. He didn't look up from the horse he was brushing. "They're good people. Your niece adores you. She's easy to please. Just pick her up and she's happy." Lila leaned against the stall door. "Your mother's getting worse." That made him pause. "I know. She can't hold a fork anymore without help. She can barely dress herself, and she started dropping things mid-sentence, like she forgets what she was saying." "I know," Gideon repeated, his voice rough. "I can help her. I am helping her, but you should spend time with her, while you still can." Gideon set down the brush. When he turned to face her, his expression was raw. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see her getting worse every day? I think you're avoiding it, staying out here, working yourself to death, instead of being in there with her." "What am I supposed to say to her? Sorry you're dying, Ma. Thanks for everything?" His voice cracked. "I watched Thomas die. I can't watch her too." The pain in his voice cut through Lila's practiced calm. She stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You're going to watch her die whether you want to or not. The only choice you have is whether you're by her side when it happens, or out here hiding in the barn." Gideon's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Lila thought he might yell at her, throw her out, tell her she had no right to speak to him this way. Instead, he turned away. "Get back to the house. It's cold." Lila left him there in the barn, surrounded by horses and shadows and the grief he couldn't escape. But the next morning, Gideon came to breakfast and sat with Clara for an hour before heading out to work. And that night, Lila heard him playing the old fiddle in the front room, hesitant at first, then stronger, the music filling the house for the first time in 2 years. Clara wept. Lila said nothing, and Gideon played until his fingers ached and the last note faded into silence. The calendar turned to January. The snows deepened, and in town, rumors circulated that the Kane brothers had been seen in a saloon in Red Butte, drinking and talking about old debts. Jed brought the news back from town, his face grim. He found Gideon in the equipment shed and delivered the information in a low voice, but Lila was close enough to hear. "They're asking about you, boss. About the ranch. Where it is. How many hands you've got. How many of them?" 3, maybe 4. Hard to say for sure." Gideon straightened, his expression going cold and dangerous. "Tell the hands to keep their rifles close. No one works alone. And if anyone sees riders who don't belong, they come get me immediately." "You think they'll hit us?" "I think they're here for a reason, and it's not to admire the scenery." That night, Gideon brought extra rifles into the house and checked the locks on every door and window. He moved through the rooms with military precision, and Lila watched him transform from a grieving rancher into something harder and more dangerous. "What should I do if they come?" she asked. "Get Ma to the cellar. There's a bolt on the inside. Lock yourselves in and don't come out until I say." "What about you?" "I'll handle it." Lila wanted to argue, to say that he couldn't fight 4 men alone, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This was what he'd been built for. Not grief, not gentleness, but this cold, hard readiness for violence. "Be careful," she said instead. Something flickered in his eyes. "Didn't know you cared." "Your mother cares. That's enough." He nodded and went back to his preparations. The attack came 3 nights later. Lila woke to the sound of breaking glass. For a heartbeat, she lay frozen in the narrow bed, her mind sluggish with sleep. Then the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night, and she was moving, throwing off the quilts and grabbing her dress from the chair. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons as another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by men's voices shouting in the yard. She ran barefoot into the hallway and nearly collided with Gideon. He was dressed, a rifle in his hands and a pistol shoved into his belt. His face was hard as granite in the dim lamplight. "Get Ma to the cellar," he said. "Now." "What's happening?" "They're here. Go." He was down the stairs before she could respond, moving with frightening speed for a man his size. Lila heard the front door slam open and Gideon's voice bellowing orders to the hands. Then Clara was calling her name from the bedroom, her voice high with fear. Lila found the older woman trying to get out of bed, her shaking hands tangling in the blankets. "It's all right," Lila said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "We need to get downstairs." "What's happening? Is it the Canes?" "I don't know. Gideon said to get you to the cellar." She helped Clara into her robe and slippers, supporting the older woman's weight as they made their way down the stairs. Through the front windows, Lila could see orange light flickering in the yard, growing brighter with each passing second. The barn. Someone had set fire to the barn. "Sweet mercy," Clara whispered. Another rifle shot cracked, and somewhere outside a man screamed. Lila's hands were steady as she guided Clara toward the kitchen and the cellar door, but her mind was racing. The horses were in that barn. The winter hay. Tools and equipment worth hundreds of dollars. She got the cellar door open and helped Clara down the steep wooden stairs. The space below was dark and smelled of earth and stored potatoes. Lila fumbled for the lamp she knew was kept on a shelf near the bottom, struck a match, and coaxed the wick to life. The cellar was small and low-ceilinged, lined with shelves that held preserves and root vegetables. There were 2 chairs, some old blankets, and a bucket of water. Provisions Gideon must have placed here in the last few days, preparing for exactly this situation. "Sit," Lila told Clara, guiding her to one of the chairs. "I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" "To bolt the door like Gideon said." She started back up the stairs, but Clara's voice stopped her. "Lila, don't go back out there. I'm just going to lock us in. Promise me you'll stay down here. Whatever happens up there, you'll stay here with me." Lila met the older woman's eyes. Clara was terrified, but there was something else in her expression, a plea that went deeper than simple fear for their safety. "I promise," Lila said. She climbed back up into the kitchen. Through the window, she could see the barn fully engulfed now, flames climbing 50 feet into the black sky and throwing wild shadows across the snow. Men were running everywhere, Gideon's hands forming a bucket line from the well, though Lila could see it was already hopeless. The barn was lost. They were just trying to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings. Then she saw the riders. 4 men on horseback circling the yard like wolves, their faces hidden by bandanas. One of them had a torch and was riding toward the equipment shed. Another was firing his pistol at the bucket line, forcing the hands to scatter. Gideon stood in the center of the chaos like a rock in a flood, his rifle to his shoulder. He fired once, and one of the riders jerked backward in his saddle but stayed mounted. The rider wheeled his horse and fired back. The muzzle flashed bright in the darkness. Lila's breath caught. She saw Gideon stagger, saw him press his hand to his shoulder, but he didn't go down. He worked the rifle's action and fired again, and this time the rider toppled from his horse with a cry that carried across the yard. The other riders pulled back, shouting to each other. The one with the torch threw it onto the roof of the equipment shed, and the dry wood caught immediately, flames racing across the shingles. Lila backed away from the window, her heart in her throat. She should go back down to the cellar. She'd promised Clara, but her feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen, watching the nightmare unfold outside. Jed appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse with 3 of the hands behind him, all armed. They took up positions behind the water trough and started firing at the riders in controlled bursts. One of the horses went down screaming, throwing its rider into the snow. The man scrambled up and ran for cover behind the chicken coop. Gideon was already moving to cut him off, blood streaming down his left arm, but his rifle steady. He rounded the corner of the coop, and there was a brief, brutal exchange of gunfire. Then silence. Gideon walked back into view, his rifle smoking. He didn't look at the body behind him. The remaining 2 riders seemed to realize they were outmatched. They fired a few more wild shots and then spurred their horses toward the trees at the edge of the property. Jed and the hands kept shooting until the riders disappeared into the darkness, their hoofbeats fading. For a moment, everything was still, except for the roar of the burning buildings. Then Gideon turned to survey the damage, and Lila saw his face clearly in the firelight. He looked like a man carved from stone in rage, his eyes burning as hot as the flames consuming his barn. "Get those fires out," he shouted. "Save what you can." The hands moved to obey, working the pump and hauling buckets even though the barn was clearly beyond saving. The equipment shed might still be salvageable if they acted fast. Lila realized she was still standing in the kitchen, still watching through the window like a spectator at a play. She turned and ran down the cellar stairs. Clara was sitting exactly where Lila had left her, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles were white. "What's happening?" "They're gone. The riders. Gideon and the hands drove them off." Lila was breathing hard, her heart still racing. "But the barn is burning, the equipment shed too. Anyone hurt?" "I don't know. I saw Gideon take a bullet to the shoulder, but he was still moving." Clara closed her eyes. "That boy. That damn stubborn boy." They waited in the cellar while the sounds of chaos continued above, men shouting, the crash of burning timbers, the frantic work of trying to contain the fires. Lila paced the small space, unable to sit still. She'd promised to stay down here, but every instinct screamed at her to go up and help. "He told you to stay put," Clara said, reading her thoughts. "And for once, you should listen to him. There are wounded men up there. The fire is still burning. You could get yourself killed, or distract Gideon when he needs to focus." Clara's voice was firm, despite the trembling of her hands. "I know you want to help, but the best thing you can do right now is stay alive and keep me company." Lila sank into the other chair and forced herself to breathe slowly. Clara was right. She'd be no use to anyone if she got shot running around in the dark. So they waited. Minutes stretched into hours. The sounds above gradually changed from frantic to exhausted. The shouting stopped. The frantic footsteps slowed. Finally, the cellar door opened and Gideon's voice called down. "It's clear. You can come up." Lila helped Clara up the stairs, moving slowly to accommodate the older woman's unsteady gait. When they emerged into the kitchen, dawn was breaking gray and cold over the valley, and the air was thick with smoke. Gideon stood by the stove, his left arm hanging useless at his side and blood soaking his shirt. Jed was behind him, cutting away the fabric to expose the wound. "Sit down before you fall down," Jed was saying. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding all over the floor. Sit." Gideon sat, his jaw clenched against the pain. Lila moved closer and saw the bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone, but leaving a ragged wound that was still seeping blood. "I need clean cloth," she said, "and whiskey. The good bottle in the pantry, not the rot gut." Jed raised an eyebrow but moved to get the supplies. Lila washed her hands at the basin and then examined the wound with steady fingers. She'd seen worse in Baltimore. Mill accidents, street fights, the casual violence of tenement life. She knew how to clean and bind injuries, how to stop bleeding, how to tell when something needed a doctor and when it just needed time. "You're lucky," she said. "Went clean through. No bone fragments I can feel." "Feels real lucky," Gideon muttered. Jed returned with the whiskey and clean rags. Lila poured whiskey over the wound and Gideon went rigid, a low sound escaping through his teeth. She worked quickly, packing the wound with clean cloth and binding it tightly with strips she'd torn from an old sheet. "You need to keep this clean and dry," she said. "Change the bandage twice a day. If it starts to smell bad or you get fever, we'll need to send for a doctor." "No doctor." "Then don't get infected." She finished tying off the bandage and stepped back. "There. You'll live." Gideon looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes. "Thank you." It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. Lila nodded and turned her attention to Clara, who was sitting at the table looking pale and shaken. "Let me make you tea," Lila said. "I need something stronger than tea." Lila poured her a small glass of whiskey, and Clara drank it in one swallow, shuddering. Outside, the hands were gathered in the yard, staring at the smoking ruins of the barn and the equipment shed. The barn was completely gone, just a black skeleton of charred timbers and ash. The shed had fared better. Half the roof was burned away, but the walls still stood, and some of the equipment inside might be salvageable. Gideon pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. Jed steadied him with a hand on his good shoulder. Boss, you need to rest. I need to check the horses. We got them out, all of them. They're in the south pasture. Gideon's shoulders sagged with relief. Anyone else hurt? Tom Carter took a graze to the leg, nothing serious, and one of the raiders is dead behind the chicken coop. The other one you winged rode off with his friends, but he's bleeding bad. Probably won't make it far. The one behind the coop, anyone recognize him? Jed nodded slowly. Yeah, it's Eli Kane. The name hung in the air like smoke. Gideon's expression went very still. You're sure? Positive. I saw him in town 2 years back, before all this started. It's him. Gideon walked to the door and stood looking out at the ruins of his barn. Lila watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched his good hand curl into a fist. They came here to kill me, he said finally, for what I did to their brother. But they didn't have the stones to face me straight, so they burned my barn and shot at my people in the dark like cowards. We drove them off, Jed said. That's what matters. We drove them off tonight, but they'll be back, or they'll hit Samuel's place, or they'll ambush someone in town. Gideon turned away from the door. This doesn't end until they're dead or in chains. What are you thinking, boss? I'm thinking I'm going after them, today, before they get too far. Clara stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. Gideon, no, you're wounded. You need to rest. Don't you me. You just took a bullet. You've lost blood. And you want to go chasing outlaws across the territory? Her voice cracked. I won't lose another son to those animals. Gideon crossed to her and put his good hand on her shoulder. I'm not Thomas, and I'm not riding off half-cocked. I'll take Jed and 2 of the hands. We'll track them, find where they're holed up, and get the marshal involved if we can. And if you can't? Then I'll do what needs doing. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She reached up and touched Gideon's face, her shaking hand gentle against his scarred cheek. You've already done enough. You've already lost enough. When does it stop? When they're gone, when this valley is safe again. He covered her hand with his. I have to do this. You know I do. I know. Clara pulled her hand back and wiped her eyes. But I don't have to like it. Gideon looked at Lila. Keep her safe. Keep the house locked. If anyone comes around who doesn't belong, you shoot first and ask questions later. I don't have a gun. He crossed to the cabinet by the door and pulled out a small revolver. He checked that it was loaded and handed it to her, his eyes serious. It's a Smith & Wesson, 5 shots. Point and pull the trigger. The recoil will surprise you the first time, so expect it. Lila took the gun, feeling the weight of it in her hand. She'd never fired a weapon in her life, but she understood the principle. I can handle it. I believe you can. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face. You're tougher than you look, Miss Mercer. You mentioned that before. Still true. He turned to Jed. Get the horses ready. We leave in 20 minutes. The next hour was a controlled chaos of preparation. Jed in 2 hands, Tom Carter, despite his wounded leg, and a tough old cowboy named Dutch, gathered supplies and weapons while Lila packed food and made sure their canteens were full. Gideon changed his shirt and rigged a sling for his wounded arm, his face set in grim determination. Clara sat at the kitchen table and said nothing, but Lila could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at her son. When everything was ready, Gideon came back to the kitchen one last time. He kissed Clara's forehead and gripped Lila's hand briefly. If we're not back in 3 days, send word to the marshal in Cheyenne. You'll be back, Lila said, with more confidence than she felt. Yes, ma'am. Then he was gone, swinging into the saddle despite his wounded shoulder and leading the small group out of the yard at a steady trot. Layla watched from the porch until they disappeared over the rise, 4 men against the vast emptiness of the Wyoming winter. Come inside, Clara said from behind her, before you freeze. The house felt emptier than ever with Gideon gone. Lila threw herself into work, cleaning up the kitchen and making an inventory of the damage. The barn was a total loss. All the winter hay, most of the tack, tools, and equipment worth at least $1,000. The equipment shed was damaged but repairable, and they'd lost 2 chickens that had burned to death in their coop, trapped by the flames. It could have been worse. They could have lost the horses. They could have lost men. They could have lost the house itself if the wind had been blowing differently. But it was still a devastating blow to the ranch's resources and finances. The remaining hands worked to clear the debris and salvage what they could. Leela brought them coffee and food throughout the day, and they thanked her with tired nods and hollow eyes. These were men who'd seen violence before, but it never got easier. That night, Lila sat with Clara in the front room while the wind howled outside and the house creaked. Clara's hands were shaking worse than ever, and she'd barely touched her dinner. "Tell me about Thomas," Lila said. Clara looked up, surprised. "What do you want to know?" "What he was like before he died." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice soft with memory. "He was the youngest, the brightest, always laughing, always joking. Where Gideon was serious and responsible, Thomas was light and joy. He played the guitar. He could sing. He'd ride into town and come back with a new story or a new girl on his arm." She smiled. "He made everything feel possible." "Were he and Gideon close?" "Very. Gideon raised him, really, after their father died. Taught him to ride, to rope, to run a ranch. Thomas worshipped his older brother. Would follow him anywhere." The smile faded. "That's what got him killed. Following Gideon after those rustlers. Gideon blames himself." "Of course he does. He was supposed to keep Thomas safe. That was his job as the oldest. And he failed." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. "I've tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, that Thomas made his own choice to ride out that day, but Gideon won't hear it. He carries that guilt like a stone around his neck. Maybe one day he'll be able to put it down." "Maybe." Clara looked at Lila with eyes that had seen too much loss. "Or maybe he'll carry it until it kills him. Some men are like that. They can't forgive themselves, so they just work and fight until there's nothing left." Lila thought about Gideon's gray eyes and scarred face, the way he moved through the world like he was already half ghost. "I won't let that happen."
"You think you can save him?" "I think I can remind him that he's still alive, that there's more to living than just surviving." Clara reached over and patted Lila's hand. "You're good for him, whether he knows it yet or not." The second day passed with agonizing slowness. No word from Gideon, no sign of riders on the horizon, just the endless work of a ranch in winter and the constant low hum of worry. Lila kept busy. She mended clothes, reorganized the damaged pantry, helped the hands sort through what could be saved from the equipment shed. She kept Clara company and made sure the older woman ate and rested. And she kept the revolver Gideon had given her close at hand, checking the cylinder compulsively, even though she knew it was loaded. On the third day, Samuel arrived with Margaret and the children. He'd heard about the attack from a neighbor and had come immediately to check on his mother and the ranch. "Where's Gideon?" he demanded. "Tracking the Canes," Clara said. He took Jed in two hands. "They've been gone 3 days." Samuel's face darkened. "That damn fool. He's wounded and he goes chasing outlaws?" "You know your brother. He won't let this stand." "I know he has a death wish." Samuel paced the kitchen, his anger barely contained. "I should have been here. I should have helped defend the place." "You have your own family to protect," Clara said. "Your own ranch to run. Gideon didn't expect you to fight his battles." "They're not just his battles. Those animals burned our barn, shot at our people. This is family business." Margaret put a hand on his arm. "Sam, you can't help him now. He's already gone." Samuel took a breath and forced himself to calm down. He looked at Lila. "You holding up all right?" "Well enough. Gideon's lucky to have you here. Someone practical." "I'm just keeping house." "You're keeping my mother safe and this ranch running while my brother plays vigilante. That's more than just keeping house." He squeezed her shoulder. "Thank you." They stayed for dinner, and the house felt almost normal with children's laughter and the sound of conversation. But as soon as they left, the emptiness returned. That night, Lila lay in bed listening to the wind and thinking about Gideon out there somewhere in the frozen darkness, tracking dangerous men with a wounded shoulder and a heart full of rage. She thought about how quickly she'd gone from a stranger in his house to someone who worried about him, who wanted him to come home safe. She'd told herself this was just a business arrangement, room and board in exchange for housework, nothing more. But somewhere in the last month that had changed. She wasn't sure when or how, but it had.
and now she lay awake wondering if he was warm enough, if his wound had opened up, if he was riding into a trap. On the afternoon of the fourth day, riders appeared on the horizon. Lila saw them from the kitchen window, 4 shapes moving slowly through the snow. She grabbed the revolver and ran to the porch, her heart in her throat. As they got closer, she recognized Gideon's massive frame in the lead. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she had to grip the porch railing to stay standing. They rode into the yard and Lila saw immediately that something was different. Gideon and his men were exhausted, covered in trail dust and mud, but they were also leading 2 additional horses with men slung over the saddles, hands bound. Prisoners. Gideon dismounted stiffly, favoring his wounded shoulder. His eyes found Lila on the porch, and something passed between them, a moment of connection, of recognition. "We got them," he said simply. Jed swung down from his horse and helped secure the prisoners. Caught up to them in a canyon about 20 miles north. They'd made camp, figured they'd lost us. He grinned. Boss tracked them like a bloodhound. The 2 prisoners were hauled off their horses and pushed to their knees in the snow. They were young men, maybe mid-20s, with the hard eyes and scarred knuckles of men who'd lived rough lives. One had a bandage wrapped around his ribs, soaked through with old blood. The other looked uninjured but terrified. "The wounded one is Cole Kane," Gideon said. "The other is his cousin, Jake Murdoch. The other 2 riders got away, but we got these 2 and they're going to answer for what they did." "You taking them to the marshal?" Lila asked. "Eventually. First I want some answers." Gideon looked down at the prisoners with cold eyes. "Who planned the attack? Who gave the orders?" The wounded one, Cole, spat in the snow. "Go to hell, Rourke!" Gideon crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the outlaw. "You burned my barn, shot my men, terrorized my family, and you did it because I killed your brother when he drew on me first." "That about right?" Cole's eyes were hard. "You murdered Eli. I shot Eli when he went for his gun. That's not murder. That's self-defense." Gideon's voice was flat, emotionless. "But what you did, coming onto my property in the middle of the night, setting fires, that's attempted murder. That's arson. That's a hanging offense. You got no proof. I've got your cousin here, who's already confessed everything to avoid getting shot. It was a bluff, but Cole didn't know that. And I've got your brother's body, if you want to identify it. He's still behind my chicken coop where I left him." The color drained from Cole's face. "You killed Eli? He came onto my land with a gun and a torch. What did you think would happen?" Cole lunged forward, but Jed and Dutch grabbed him and hauled him back. He was shouting now, struggling against their grip. "I'll kill you! I swear I'll—" Gideon stood up and nodded to Jed. "Gag him, both of them. We'll keep them in the root cellar until the marshal can collect them." The prisoners were hauled away, still fighting. Gideon stood in the yard looking at the ruins of his barn, and Lila saw the exhaustion creep across his face now that the immediate danger was past. She walked down from the porch and touched his good arm. "You need to sit down. I need to see to the horses. The hands can see to the horses. You need to sit down before you fall down." She steered him toward the house. "When's the last time you slept?" "I don't remember." "Exactly." She got him inside and into a chair at the kitchen table. Clara appeared from her room, her face lighting up when she saw her son. "You're alive." "I'm alive." "And you caught them?" "2 of them. The others ran." Gideon leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. "It's over, Ma. They won't be coming back." Clara sat down across from him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you for coming home." Lila made coffee and food while Gideon told them the whole story. How they'd tracked the Canes north through the snow, following blood trails and hoof prints. How they'd found their camp in a narrow canyon and surrounded it at dawn. How there'd been a brief fight, and Gideon had put a bullet through Cole Kane's ribs, ending the resistance. "We'll turn them over to Marshal Brennan in Cheyenne," Gideon finished. "He's been hunting the Kane outfit for months. This'll give him 2 of them and enough evidence to hang them both." "And the ones that got away?" Lila asked. "They're wounded and on foot. They won't last long out there." Gideon's voice was matter-of-fact. "If the cold doesn't get them, the wolves will." It was a harsh truth, but Lila didn't flinch from it. This was frontier justice, swift, brutal, and final. She'd known what she was getting into when she came west. Gideon finally went upstairs to sleep, moving like a man at the end of his strength. Lila checked his bandage and found it filthy and crusted with dried blood.
This needs changing. Later. Now, sit down. He sat. She unwrapped the bandage and examined the wound. It was inflamed and angry-looking, but there was no smell of infection. She cleaned it with fresh whiskey. Gideon gritted his teeth but didn't make a sound, and wrapped it with clean cloth. "You did good work," he said when she was finished. "It's healing. That's what matters." He caught her hand before she could pull away. His palm was rough and warm against hers. "I mean, all of it. Taking care of Ma, keeping the house running, not panicking during the attack." His gray eyes met hers. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for. I told you I was tough." "You did." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm starting to believe a lot of things I didn't before." Then he let go and headed to his room, leaving Lila standing in the hallway with her heart beating faster than it should and her hand still warm from his touch. Gideon slept for 16 hours straight, and when he finally came downstairs the next morning, his face had lost some of that hollowed-out look that had haunted him for days. Lila had breakfast waiting, eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits, and he ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. "The marshal's coming tomorrow," Jed said, coming in from the cold with snow on his shoulders. "Got word from town. He'll take custody of the prisoners and transport them to Cheyenne for trial." Gideon nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Good. The sooner they're off my land, the better. Brennan wants to talk to you too. Get your statement about what happened." "I'll tell him the same thing I told you. They came onto my property armed and set fire to my barn. I defended what's mine." Gideon's voice was flat, daring anyone to challenge that version of events. No one did. What he'd done was legal by any frontier standard. A man had the right to protect his property and his family from armed intruders. The Canes had come looking for revenge and found justice instead. Marshal Brennan arrived the next afternoon with 2 deputies, riding into the yard on horses that steamed in the cold air. He was a weathered man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence to be shocked by anything. "Gideon," he said, dismounting, "heard you had some trouble." "That's one way to put it." Brennan surveyed the burned ruins of the barn and let out a low whistle. "Looks like they did a number on you." "Could have been worse. We got the horses out and only lost 1 man. Gideon gestured toward the root cellar. "The ones who did it are down there. Cole Kane and Jake Murdoch. Murdoch's singing like a canary, and Kane's got a bullet wound courtesy of my rifle." "You willing to testify?" "If I have to, but I'd rather just give you my statement and be done with it." Brennan pulled out a worn notebook and pencil. "Fair enough. Start from the beginning." Gideon told the story in the same flat, emotionless voice he'd used with Lila and Clara. The facts were simple and damning. The Canes had come for revenge. They'd burned his barn and shot at his people. He'd tracked them down and brought them back alive, which was more mercy than they'd shown him. Brennan wrote it all down, his pencil scratching across the paper. When Gideon finished, the marshal looked up and studied him for a long moment. "You know they'll hang for this." "I know." "You all right with that?" Gideon's expression didn't change. "They made their choices. Now they get to live with the consequences." Brennan nodded slowly. "I'll need statements from your foreman and the other witnesses too. But based on what you've told me, this is a clear case of self-defense and defense of property." He closed the notebook. "You did the right thing bringing them in alive. Saved me the trouble of hunting them myself." The deputies hauled the prisoners out of the root cellar and loaded them onto horses, their hands bound and their faces sullen. Cole Kane stared at Gideon with pure hatred as they rode past, but he didn't say a word. Jake Murdoch just looked defeated, like he'd already accepted his fate. Brennan tipped his hat to Gideon. "You need anything, you send word, and if those other 2 show up again, you shoot first and send for me after." That was the plan. After the marshal and his prisoners disappeared down the valley road, a strange quiet settled over the ranch. The immediate danger was gone. The men who'd burned the barn were in custody. Justice would be served, but the damage remained. The barn was still a smoking ruin. The equipment shed was half destroyed.
and the ranch was out thousands of dollars in lost hay and equipment at a time when they could least afford it. That night at dinner, Lila brought up the ledgers again. She'd been studying them for weeks now, cross-referencing expenses and income, looking for ways to stretch their resources further. "We need to talk about money," she said. Gideon looked up from his plate. "What about it?" "The fire cost you at least $3,000 in buildings and equipment, maybe more when you factor in the lost hay and the cost of rebuilding." She opened the ledger to the page she'd marked. "You've got some savings, but not enough to cover everything. And spring roundup is still 3 months away." "I'll manage." "How?" Gideon set down his fork. "Same way I always do. Work harder. Sell more cattle. Cut expenses where I can. You're already working yourself to death, and you've been underselling your cattle for years." Lila turned the ledger so he could see the numbers she'd circled. "Look at these sale prices. You're leaving money on the table every single time." "I get fair prices." "You get quick prices. There's a difference." She pointed to a sale from last fall. "You sold 100 head at $8 each when the market price in Cheyenne was 10. That's $200 you didn't have to lose." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I don't have time to haggle with buyers or wait for prices to go up. I've got a ranch to run. And I'm trying to help you run it better." Lila kept her voice calm, reasonable. "Let me handle the sales. I'll negotiate with buyers, watch the market, wait for better prices. You focus on the ranch work, and I'll focus on making sure you get every dollar you've earned." Clara watched this exchange with interest, her trembling hands wrapped around her teacup. "She has a point, Gideon. You've always been more interested in the work than the business side of things." "Because the work is what matters. The cattle don't care about market prices." "But your bank account does," Lila said. "And so does the future of this ranch. You want to rebuild that barn? Replace the equipment? You need money. And the best way to get it is to stop giving it away to buyers who are taking advantage of you." Gideon stared at her, his gray eyes unreadable. For a moment, Lila thought he was going to refuse, going to retreat behind that wall of stubborn pride that kept him isolated from help. Then he pushed the ledger back toward her. "Fine. You handle the sales, but if you lose money or make deals I don't like, we go back to the old way." "Deal." It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. Gideon had just given her real authority over part of the ranch's business. He'd trusted her judgment. That meant more than he probably realized. Over the next few weeks, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The hands worked on clearing the debris from the barn and salvaging what they could from the equipment shed. Gideon drew up plans for a new barn, bigger than the old one, with better ventilation and a hayloft that could hold twice as much feed. "We'll start building in March," he told Jed. "Soon as the ground thaws enough to dig post holes." "Where's the money coming from?" "The bank in Cheyenne will extend credit against the spring cattle sales. It'll cost us interest, but we don't have much choice." Lila listened to this conversation from the kitchen and made a note in the ledger. Interest meant throwing away money they couldn't spare. She needed to find a way to bring in extra income before spring. The answer came from an unexpected source. She was in town buying supplies when she overheard two ranchers talking about the upcoming Territorial Cattle Association meeting in Cheyenne. They were discussing the need for breeding bulls, good quality animals with proven bloodlines that could improve their herds. Lila thought about the cattle she'd seen on Gideon's ranch. He had some fine animals, including a massive Hereford bull that Jed had mentioned was one of the best in the territory. A bull like that could command serious money as breeding stock. When she got back to the ranch, she found Gideon in the barn working on tack repair despite his still healing shoulder. She leaned against the stall door and watched him work for a moment before speaking. "Tell me about your Hereford bull." He glanced up. "Red King? What about him? Is he good breeding stock?" "Best I've ever had. Strong bloodlines, even temperament, throws healthy calves every time." Gideon went back to his work. "Why?" "Because I heard ranchers in town talking about the need for quality bulls. They're willing to pay premium prices for breeding rights." Gideon's hand stilled. "You want to lease out Red King?" "I want to make money off an asset you're not fully utilizing. Keep him here on the ranch, but let other ranchers bring their cows for breeding. Charge a stud fee for each cow." She'd done the math on the ride back from town. If you charge $20 per cow and breed 20 cows a season, that's $400. More than enough to offset the interest on that bank loan. Gideon set down the leather he'd been working on and stood up, his full height making the barn suddenly feel smaller. He crossed his arms and studied her with that intense gaze that had initially intimidated her, but now just made her meet his eyes steadily. "You've been thinking about this. It's what you pay me for, to think about the business side of things. I pay you to keep house. You pay me to help run this ranch however I can. This is how I can help." She pushed off the stall door and walked closer to him. "You've got valuable assets here beyond just cattle you sell for beef. Your breeding stock, your land, your water rights. If you leverage them properly, you can bring in income year-round instead of just at Roundup." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, set it up. But you handle the arrangements. I don't have time to deal with ranchers and their breeding schedules." "I will." "And Lila?" He waited until she looked at him. "Thank you for caring about this place like it's yours." The words settled warm in her chest. "It is mine. For now, anyway." "For now," he echoed, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was starting to think of it as more permanent than either of them had initially planned. Word spread quickly about the breeding services. Within 2 weeks, Lila had 5 ranchers lined up and deposits paid. She kept meticulous records, scheduled the breeding appointments, and made sure every transaction was documented in the ledger. The money started coming in, and for the first time since the fire, the ranch's financial situation began to look less desperate. Clara watched all this with quiet satisfaction. Her illness was getting worse. She could barely feed herself now, and some days she struggled to speak clearly. But she smiled every time she saw Gideon and Lila working together, their heads bent over the ledgers or discussing ranch business at the dinner table. "You're good for him," she told Lila one afternoon while Lila was helping her get dressed. "He's starting to live again instead of just surviving. I'm just doing my job. You're doing more than that. You're reminding him what it feels like to have a partner, someone to share the burden with." Clara's hands trembled as Lila buttoned her dress. "I won't be here much longer, months maybe. Not more than a year. I need to know he won't be alone when I'm gone." Lila's throat tightened. "He won't be, I promise." "Good." Clara patted her hand. "Because I think you two might actually be happy together, if you give it a chance." The thought of happiness felt foreign to Lila. She'd spent so many years just focused on survival, working, saving, enduring. She hadn't considered that coming to Wyoming might offer her something beyond security. But watching Gideon at dinner that night, seeing the way the lamplight softened his harsh features and the way he listened when she talked about the ranch business, she realized Clara might be right. There was something growing between them, something that had started as a practical arrangement but was becoming something more. March arrived with the promise of spring. The snow began to melt, turning the valley into a sea of mud. The cattle grew restless, ready for fresh grass, and neighbors began arriving at the ranch with timber and tools, ready to help rebuild the barn. It was an unspoken rule of frontier life. When disaster struck, neighbors helped. Gideon had helped build barns and houses for half the ranchers in the valley over the years, and now they were returning the favor. Samuel came with his sons. Jed organized the work crews, and ranchers Lila had never met showed up with wagons full of lumber and hands willing to work. "This is how we survive out here," one old rancher told Lila as she served coffee to the workers. "Together, because alone, this land will kill you." The barn went up faster than Lila had expected. Gideon had designed it well, a sturdy structure with a stone foundation and thick timber walls that would stand up to Wyoming winters for decades. The men worked from dawn to dusk, sawing and hammering and cursing good-naturedly when things didn't fit quite right. Lila kept them fed, cooking massive amounts of food and hauling it out to the work site. The hands praised her cooking, and more than one rancher mentioned that Gideon was lucky to have found such a capable wife. The word wife always gave her pause. They weren't married. This was still technically a trial arrangement, though neither of them had mentioned it ending after the agreed-upon month. March was 3 months since she'd arrived, and the subject of her leaving simply hadn't come up. She wasn't sure what that meant. Whether Gideon was satisfied with the arrangement and assumed she'd stay, whether he'd simply been too busy to think about it, or whether, like her, he'd started to see this as something more than a business transaction. One evening, after the workers had left and the new barn was nearly complete, Lila found Gideon standing in the doorway of the structure, looking around at the fresh timber and clean straw with something like satisfaction on his face. "It's better than the old one," she said, coming to stand beside him. "It is." He ran his hand along one of the support beams. "Stronger. More room for hay storage, better ventilation." He paused. "Wouldn't have been possible without your work on the finances. The breeding fees helped. More than helped. They saved us." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. "I was wrong about you." "How so?" "I thought you were desperate, running from something, that you'd last maybe 2 weeks before you realized what you'd gotten yourself into and ran back east." He shook his head. "But you're not desperate. You're just practical, and you're tougher than half the men I've hired over the years. I told you I could work." "You did. I should have listened." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her temple. "I'm glad you stayed." Lila's breath caught. This was the closest they'd come to acknowledging that something had shifted between them, that the month trial was long over and neither of them wanted her to leave. "I'm glad too," she said quietly. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. She could see the thought cross his mind, see him weighing it, but then he stepped back, putting safe distance between them again. "We should get inside. It's getting cold." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, and Lila wondered if he was as confused as she was about what was happening between them, if he felt the same pull she did, or if she was imagining things. The barn was completed 2 days later. The ranchers gathered for a small celebration, nothing fancy, just food and drink and the satisfaction of a job well done. Gideon thanked everyone who'd helped, his voice gruff with emotion. "This valley takes care of its own," one old rancher said, raising his glass. "And we're glad to have you as part of it, Gideon, you and your bride both." There was that word again. Bride. Lila felt her cheeks flush as several men looked her way and smiled. She glanced at Gideon, expecting him to correct the assumption, to explain that they weren't actually married. But he didn't. He just raised his glass and said, "Thank you all, for everything." After everyone left and the house was quiet again, Clara called Lila and Gideon into the front room. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the fire, her shaking hands folded in her lap, and there was something in her expression that made Lila's stomach tighten with worry. "Sit down, both of you," Clara said. They sat. Gideon looked wary, like he knew bad news was coming. Lila reached over without thinking and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. He squeezed back, grateful for the contact. Clara looked at their joined hands and smiled. "Good, that makes this easier." She took a breath. "I'm dying. We all know it. The doctor said months, and I believe him. I can feel myself getting weaker every day." "Ma," Gideon started, but Clara held up a trembling hand. "Let me finish. I don't have the strength for long speeches anymore." She looked at Lila. "You came here as a business arrangement, room and board in exchange for housekeeping. But you've become so much more than that. You've saved this ranch with your practical mind and hard work. You've taken care of me with kindness and patience, and you've helped my son remember how to live." Lila felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm just doing what needed to be done." "No, you're doing more than that. You're building a life here, a real life." Clara turned to Gideon. "And you. You've been half dead for 2 years, walking around like a ghost. But I've watched you change since Lila arrived. You smile now, you laugh. You look forward to coming home instead of treating it like just another place to sleep." Gideon's hand tightened on Lila's. "Where are you going with this, Ma?" "I'm saying you two should make this official. Stop dancing around it and get married properly." Clara's voice was firm despite the trembling. "Not because it's practical or convenient, but because you care about each other, because you're good together, because life is too short to waste on pretending you don't feel what you feel." The words hung in the air. Lila's heart was racing. She looked at Gideon and found him already looking at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Lila thought about the last 3 months, about the barn burning and the Kane brothers and the endless work of keeping the ranch running, about learning to read Gideon's moods and watching him slowly open up, about the moment his hand had touched her hair and she'd felt something shift in her chest. "I think your mother is right," she said. "I think we're good together, and I think I'd like to stay, if you want me to." "I want you to." The words came out rough, almost fierce. "I don't want you to leave, ever." "Then I won't." Clara was crying now, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. "Good, that's good. Now go into town tomorrow and make it legal. I want to see you two properly married before I die." The next day, Gideon and Lila rode into Red Butte together. The town clerk married them in his office with Jed and the shopkeeper's wife as witnesses. There was no fancy dress, no flowers, no celebration, just two people signing their names in a register and promising to build a life together. When the clerk pronounced them married, Gideon kissed Lila for the first time. It was brief and chaste, but it felt like a promise, like a beginning. On the ride back to the ranch, Lila looked at the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to Gideon's grandmother. It felt right there, like it belonged. "You sure about this?" Gideon asked. "Are you?" "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." He reached over and took her hand. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on this place. Thank you for letting me stay." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the spring sun warm on their faces and the valley spreading green and gold around them. When they reached the ranch, Clara was waiting on the porch. She took one look at their faces and started crying again. "Come here," she said, opening her arms. "Let me see my daughter." Lila embraced her, and for the first time since leaving Baltimore, she felt like she'd truly come home. That night, Gideon moved Lila's things from the small upstairs bedroom to his room. They were tentative with each other, still learning this new dynamic. But when they lay down together that night, Lila curled against his side and his arm came around her shoulders, and it felt natural. Right. "I never thought I'd do this again," Gideon said into the darkness. "Let someone in, care about someone." "Neither did I. But here we are." "Here we are," Lila echoed. Outside, the new barn stood solid and strong against the Wyoming sky. The cattle were settling for the night. The valley was quiet and peaceful. And inside the ranch house, two people who'd started as strangers were building something that looked a lot like happiness. Spring came to Red Butte Valley like a whispered promise, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing the first green shoots from the frozen earth. The cattle grew fat on new grass, the creek ran high and cold with snowmelt, and the ranch buzzed with the purposeful energy of roundup season approaching. But inside the ranch house, time was running out. Clara's decline had accelerated after the wedding, as if seeing Gideon and Lila married had allowed her to finally let go of the worry she'd carried for so long. Her hands no longer trembled, they simply didn't work at all. Her speech came in fragments, words escaping her mid-sentence. Some mornings she didn't recognize the room she'd slept in for 40 years. Lila moved her bed downstairs to the front room so Clara wouldn't have to manage the stairs. She fed her, bathed her, dressed her like a child. And through it all, Clara maintained a fierce dignity, apologizing constantly for the burden she'd become. "You're not a burden," Lila said for the 100th time, spooning broth into Clara's mouth. "Your family." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't grip the spoon anymore, couldn't brush her own hair, couldn't do any of the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life. But she could still feel, still love, still worry about the son who sat beside her bed each evening, holding her hand and talking to her about the ranch as if she might still offer advice. Gideon had changed in ways Lila was still cataloging. The hard edges hadn't disappeared. They probably never would, but they'd softened. He smiled more easily now, laughed at things that wouldn't have cracked his expression 6 months ago. And he'd started playing the fiddle again, filling the house with music on the evenings when Clara was feeling strong enough to listen. One night in early April, Lila woke to find Gideon's side of the bed empty. She pulled on her robe and went downstairs, following the sound of his voice to the front room where Clara lay in her sickbed. He was sitting beside her in the dark, holding her hand and speaking in a low voice. Lila stayed in the doorway, not wanting to intrude. "Remember when Thomas and I were boys, and we convinced you we'd found gold in the creek?" Gideon's voice was soft with memory. "You knew we were lying, but you played along anyway, made us pan for hours while you did the washing. We came back with fool's gold, and you acted like we'd struck it rich." Clara made a sound that might have been laughter. You were always doing that, making us feel like we could do anything, be anything. Gideon's voice cracked. I don't know how to do this without you, Ma. I don't know how to keep going when you're gone. Yes, you do. Clara's words were slurred but clear enough. You have Lila now. You have the ranch. You have a life to live. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. Promise me you'll live it, really live it, not just survive like you've been doing. I promise. And be happy. You deserve happiness, Gideon. After everything you've lost, you deserve to have something good. I am happy, Ma. For the first time in years, I actually am. Lila's throat tightened. She slipped back upstairs before either of them could see her, climbing into the empty bed and pressing her face into the pillow to muffle the sound of her tears. Clara died 3 days later, on a morning when the sun broke through the clouds and turned the valley gold. She simply didn't wake up. Lila found her when she brought in the breakfast tray, lying peaceful and still in the bed that had become her world. Gideon took the news with the same stony expression he'd worn after Thomas died, his face closing down like a shuttered house. But when he went in to see his mother's body, Lila heard him break. The sound of his grief was raw and terrible, all the more so because he tried so hard to contain it. She gave him privacy, standing guard outside the door, while he said goodbye to the woman who'd raised him and loved him and shaped him into the man he'd become. They buried Clara 2 days later in the small cemetery on the hill behind the ranch, next to her husband and her youngest son. Half the valley came to pay their respects. Clara had been well loved, a woman who'd helped birth babies, nursed the sick, and fed anyone who came to her door hungry. The service was simple. Samuel spoke about their mother's strength and grace. Margaret read from a book of poetry that Clara had loved, and Gideon stood silent and still as stone while they lowered his mother into the ground, his hand gripping Lila's so tightly she thought her bones might break. After everyone left and the sun began to set, Gideon stood alone at the grave while Lila waited by the wagon. She watched him trace his fingers over the fresh-carved headstone, his massive shoulders bowed with grief. When he finally came back to her, his eyes were red but dry. He'd cried all the tears he had. Now there was just the hollow ache of loss. Let's go home, he said. That night, Lila held him while he slept fitfully, waking every few hours with a gasp like he'd forgotten how to breathe. She stroked his hair and murmured nonsense comfort until he settled again, and she thought about how strange it was that 6 months ago she wouldn't have known how to do this, how to offer comfort without words, how to simply be present in someone's grief. But she'd learned, they'd both learned, how to be partners, how to share the burden, how to hold each other up when the weight became too much. The ranch demanded their attention whether they were ready or not. Spring roundup was in 2 weeks, and there was work to be done. Gideon threw himself into preparations with the same grim focus he'd shown after Thomas died, working dawn to dusk and falling into bed exhausted. Lila let him grieve in his own way while she kept the household running. She cooked for the hands, managed the breeding appointments for Red King, and kept meticulous records of every dollar that came in or went out. The breeding fees had exceeded her projections. Word had spread about the quality of Gideon's bull, and ranchers from 3 counties away were bringing their cows for servicing. One evening, about 2 weeks after Clara's death, Lila was working on the ledgers when she noticed something that made her pause. She double-checked her numbers, ran the calculations again, and felt her heart skip. When Gideon came in from the barn, she met him at the door with the ledger in her hands. "We need to talk about money," she said. He sighed, hanging up his hat. "What now? More equipment we can't afford?" Actually, the opposite. She opened the ledger to the page she'd marked. "Look at this. The breeding fees, plus the better prices I negotiated on the fall cattle sales, plus the money we saved by cutting unnecessary expenses. We're actually ahead. By almost $2,000. Gideon took the ledger and studied the numbers, his brow furrowed. "That can't be right. I've checked it 3 times. It's right." Lila could hear the pride in her own voice. "We're not just surviving anymore, Gideon. We're profitable. Really profitable. Enough that we can pay off the bank loan early and still have money left over." He set the ledger down and looked at her with something like wonder. "You did this. We did this. You run the ranch, I run the business side. Partners, Remember? Partners, he echoed. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and grateful and full of something that felt a lot like love. When they broke apart, Lila was breathless. What was that for? For being smarter than me, for seeing potential I couldn't see, for saving this ranch. He touched her face gently. For saving me. You didn't need saving, you just needed help. Same thing, maybe. He kissed her again, softer this time. Thank you, Lila, for everything. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Lila was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard horses in the yard and looked out to see Marshal Brennan and two men she didn't recognize dismounting. Gideon came out of the barn, his expression wary. Lila dried her hands and stepped onto the porch, close enough to hear but not interfere. Marshal, Gideon said, wasn't expecting you. I know, sorry to drop in unannounced. Brennan gestured to the two men with him. This is Judge Morrison and District Attorney Carver. They're here about the Kane trial. Gideon's jaw tightened. Thought that was settled. They confessed. They did, and they hanged for it 3 days ago. Brennan pulled a thick envelope from his coat. But before he died, Cole Kane made a full confession. Not just about the attack on your ranch, but about everything. All the rustling, all the murders, all the crimes the Kane outfit committed over the past 5 years. The judge stepped forward. Mr. Rourke, Cole Kane's confession corroborated everything you told us about your brother Thomas's death. The rustling, the ambush, the murder. He paused. He also confessed that his brother, the one you killed, drew first, that you acted in self-defense when you shot him. Gideon went very still. Why are you telling me this? Because there were questions, the district attorney said. Some people in the territory thought maybe you'd executed an unarmed man, that you'd gone too far in your grief. He met Gideon's eyes. But Cole's confession makes it clear. You were defending yourself and bringing justice for your brother. Everything you did was legal and right. Brennan handed Gideon the envelope. This is a formal letter from the territorial court clearing you of any wrongdoing in the death of Jacob Kane, and it's an apology from everyone who doubted you. Gideon took the envelope with shaking hands. He didn't open it. He just stood there holding it, his throat working. Also, the judge added, there's a reward, $500 for the capture of Cole Kane and Jake Murdoch. It's yours. Gideon looked up sharply. I don't want blood money. It's not blood money, it's justice. The judge's voice was firm. Those men terrorized this territory for years. You stopped them. You deserve to be compensated for the risk you took and the damage you suffered. Brennan pulled out another envelope, this one heavy with coin. Take it, Gideon. Use it to rebuild, to make something good out of all this ugliness. After a long moment, Gideon took the money. Thank you. Thank you, the marshal replied. You did this valley a service. People can sleep easier knowing the Kanes are gone. After the men left, Gideon stood in the yard holding the two envelopes and staring at nothing. Lila went to him and gently took his hand. You all right? I don't know. His voice was rough. For 2 years I've been carrying the weight of what I did, wondering if I went too far, if I became the monster I was hunting. He looked at her, his eyes bright. And now they're telling me it was right, that I was right. You were defending yourself and your family. There was never any question about that. Maybe not to you, but to me. He trailed off, shaking his head. I killed a man, Lila. Shot him and watched him die. That changes you, marks you. I thought it made me less human, less worthy of... He stopped. Of what? Of happiness. Of peace. Of you. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I can have those things after all. Lila held him tight, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her cheek. You can. You deserve all of it. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the spring sunshine, while the ranch buzzed with life around them. Roundup came and went in a blur of exhausting work. The hands gathered the cattle, separated the calves for branding, and drove the marketable steers to the railhead in Cheyenne. Lila went along to negotiate the sale, and she held firm when the buyer tried to lowball them. She'd done her research, knew the current market prices, and refused to budge until they got fair value. The buyer finally agreed to her price, grumbling about difficult women and changing times. Gideon stood behind her the whole time, his silent presence backing up her authority, and when the deal was done, he squeezed her shoulder with obvious pride. "You're terrifying when you negotiate," he said on the ride home. "I learned from mill foremen who tried to short my pay. They were a lot meaner than cattle buyers. Remind me never to argue with you about money." Smart man. With the sale completed and the reward money added to their accounts, the ranch was on solid financial footing for the first time in years. Gideon used some of the money to buy equipment and make repairs. He set aside more for the inevitable hard times that would come. And he gave each of the hands a bonus for their loyal service, which earned him gratitude and renewed dedication. But the biggest change was less tangible. The ranch no longer felt like a place Gideon was grimly holding together through sheer stubbornness. It felt like a home, a business, a future. One evening in late May, Lila was working in the garden she'd planted behind the house, vegetables and herbs that would supplement their food stores through the summer. She heard Gideon's footsteps and looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "I was just thinking." "About?" "About how different everything is now. 6 months ago, this place was dying. I was dying, even if I didn't know it, and then you showed up with your sensible dresses and your no-nonsense attitude, and everything changed." Lila stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't change anything. I just helped you see what was already there." "You changed everything," he insisted. "You brought life back to this house. You made me remember what it felt like to want to wake up in the morning instead of just forcing myself through another day." He stepped closer. "You made me remember what it felt like to be happy." "Gideon, I love you." The words came out rough but certain. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe the day you stood up to that buyer in Cheyenne. Maybe the night you bandaged my shoulder without flinching. Maybe the first morning you made coffee and didn't run screaming when you saw how I lived." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "But I love you, Lila, and I need you to know that." Lila felt tears spring to her eyes. 6 months ago, she'd been alone in a Baltimore tenement, counting coins and reading advertisements by candlelight. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly wanted, to be loved. "I love you too," she said. "I think I started falling for you the night of the fire, when I watched you run into that burning barn to save the horses. You were so brave and so stupid and so completely yourself." She laughed through her tears. "And I thought, this is a man worth staying for." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and she tasted salt from her tears and sunshine and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, Gideon took her hand and led her to the porch. They sat on the steps watching the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains gold and purple and deep shadow blue. "I've been thinking about something else too," Gideon said. "What's that?" "We should expand. Add more breeding stock. Maybe lease that section of land Samuel's been wanting to sell. Hire another hand or two." He glanced at her. "Make this place big enough to pass down to our children someday." Lila felt her breath catch. They'd never talked about children. She'd assumed Gideon's grief over losing Thomas had closed that door permanently. "Children?" she said carefully. "If you want them. I know we didn't discuss that in the arrangement, but—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "Do you want children?" Lila thought about it honestly. She'd never imagined herself as a mother. In Baltimore, children had been just another mouth to feed, another complication in an already complicated life. But here, with Gideon, with this ranch, and this valley, and this future spreading out before them, "Yes," she said, "I think I do." His smile was like sunrise. "Good, that's good." He pulled her against his side. "We'll need to add on to the house then. Can't raise a family in 2 bedrooms. Getting ahead of yourself, aren't you?" "Maybe. But Ma always said if you're going to dream, dream big." His voice caught on the mention of his mother, but the pain was softer now. Grief mixed with love and good memories instead of just raw loss. They sat in comfortable silence while the stars came out one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called,
and the cattle lowed softly as they settled for the night. This was home, Lila thought. Not the house, or the land, or even the work, but this. Sitting beside Gideon while the day faded into night, planning a future that 6 months ago she couldn't have imagined. Summer rolled across Red Butte Valley in waves of heat and green. The cattle fattened on rich grass. The garden flourished under Lila's care, and Gideon hired 2 new hands and started breaking ground for the house expansion. Samuel and Margaret visited regularly, bringing the children to run wild across the ranch. Gideon's nieces and nephews adored him, climbing on his massive frame like he was a human mountain and shrieking with laughter when he pretended to be a bear chasing them through the yard. Watching him with the children, Lila could see glimpses of the man he'd been before grief carved him into something harder. The man who played fiddle and told stories and smiled easily. That man was coming back, piece by piece, day by day. In August, Lila discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. He went very still. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this. For giving me everything. We're in this together, remember? Partners." "Partners," he agreed, pulling back to look at her with eyes bright with joy and fear and overwhelming love. "We're really doing this, building a life, a family. We really are." He touched her stomach gently, reverently. "Boy or girl?" "Too early to tell. Does it matter?" "Not even a little bit." He grinned, and the expression transformed his scarred face into something beautiful. "I'm going to be a father. You're going to be a wonderful father." News of the pregnancy spread through the valley, and Lila found herself on the receiving end of advice from every woman within 20 miles. Margaret brought her herbal tea for morning sickness. The neighbor women stopped by with baby clothes and blankets. Even the hands treated her with extra gentleness, as if she might break. Gideon became almost comically protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard, despite her protests that she was pregnant, not fragile. "You're carrying my child," he said stubbornly. "I'm allowed to worry. You're allowed to be reasonable. I'm still perfectly capable of running this household." "I know. But humor me anyway." She did, because she could see the fear beneath his protectiveness. He'd lost so much. His father, his brother, his mother. The idea of losing her or the baby terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. So she let him fuss and worry, and she loved him all the more for it. Fall came with its explosion of color and the hard work of preparing for another winter. The new section of the house was nearly complete, 2 additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen that gave them room to grow. The ranch was thriving, the cattle were healthy, and the breeding program had become so successful that Gideon had started raising his prices and still had more demand than he could meet. On a crisp October morning, Lila stood on the porch watching Gideon work with one of the young horses in the corral. He moved with easy confidence, his voice low and soothing as he gentled the skittish animal. The early sun caught the silver in his dark hair. He was only 34, but hard living had marked him and gilded his strong profile. He looked up and caught her watching, smiled that rare, beautiful smile that still made her heart skip. "What are you thinking about?" he called. "About how lucky I am," she called back. "Pretty sure I'm the lucky one." "We both are then." He finished with the horse and crossed the yard to the porch, climbing the steps and pulling her into a kiss that tasted like coffee and morning and home. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too." They stood wrapped in each other's arms while the ranch woke around them, the hands heading out to check the stock, the chickens scratching in their yard, smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. It was an ordinary morning on an ordinary day, and it was perfect. That night, Gideon played his fiddle while Lila sat mending clothes by the fire. The music filled the house with warmth and life, echoing off the new walls and making the space feel lived in and loved. When he finished the song, Lila set aside her mending and crossed to him. She took the fiddle from his hands and set it carefully aside, then sat in his lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me. For letting me stay, for building this life with me." She touched his face, tracing the scar that ran from eyebrow to cheek.
for being exactly who you are. Gideon captured her hand and kissed her palm. I should be thanking you. You came here thinking you were just going to keep house and cook meals. Instead, you saved a dying ranch and brought a dead man back to life. You were never dead, just lost. Same thing sometimes. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. But I'm found now. We both are. Outside, winter was coming, the temperature was dropping, and the cattle were moving to lower pastures. Soon the snow would fly, and the valley would lock itself away from the world for long, frozen months. But inside the ranch house, wrapped in Gideon's arms with their child growing beneath her heart and their future stretching bright and possible before them, Lila had never felt warmer. She'd come to Wyoming looking for security, for room and board, and a practical arrangement with a practical man. She'd found so much more. She'd found home. She'd found purpose. She'd found love in the arms of a scarred giant who'd forgotten how to live until she reminded him. And as Gideon carried her upstairs to their bedroom, his hands gentle and his eyes full of promise, Lila knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The ranch would thrive. The baby would come. The years would unfold in their own time, bringing joy and struggle and all the messy beauty of a life fully lived. But tonight, this moment was perfect, complete. She'd told Gideon the truth in that newspaper advertisement so many months ago. She wasn't pretty, but she could cook. She could work. She could endure. What she hadn't known then was that she could also love, could be loved in return, could build something lasting and true from the ashes of loss and loneliness. And Gideon, holding her close as sleep claimed them both, knew that his mother had been right all along. Lila was exactly what he needed, not because she could cook or keep house or manage accounts, though she did all those things brilliantly, but because she'd seen him at his worst, grief-stricken, isolated, barely human, and had chosen to stay anyway, had chosen him anyway. In the morning, there would be work. There would always be work, but there would also be laughter and love and the slow, steady building of a life worth living. The barn stood strong against the Wyoming sky, rebuilt and better than before. The cattle grazed in peaceful valleys, and in the ranch house where Clara Rourke had once worried herself sick over her lonely son, new life stirred and grew. This was home. This was family. This was enough, more than enough. It was everything.